But even if it's inflated tenfold, how is that not the worst woman to have ever lived? And we don't know her name. Welcome to the show. I'm JasonShannon, author of the books The Zimmer Insurgency, The Hounds of Harrigan, and Tiger Blues. This is a podcast about indie writing, featuring excerpts, sample chapters, short stories, upcoming news, and interviews with a variety of other indie authors. Andrew LiVecchi is a writer of epic fantasy. Since his childhood, he has been obsessed with all things ancient and medieval, starting with Ivanhoe, Robin Hood, and Greek myth, and this eventually culminated in an English PhD from Western University. In his fiction, he attempts to capture some of what he has found so endlessly fascinating about his favorite stories, drawing inspiration from classical mythology, from medieval romance, and from modern fantasy. Andrew lives in Cambridge, Ontario, and he works as a literature and humanities professor. Andrew is the author of the Lays of Athawain series, which is a Celtic-inspired medieval fantasy / sort of historical fantasy series that he's been working on. Today we are mostly discussing Book 1 in that series, Son of the Thunder Goddess, which is an intro novella that sets up the series nicely. Book 2, Rage of the Raven Queen, is out now. And Book 3, War of Princes, is being serialized on his Substack. This was a fun conversation. Andrew clearly has the same love of history that I do, and we even get a chance to nerd out about all things historical in the latter half of the episode. And we trade back and forth a few little interesting stories out of history. All right, we'll jump into Andrew in 1 second, but we got to come back to our Spotify comments. Alex Tilley, once again, has been very busy leaving comments. He leaves a comment here on episode 79. This is the episode with VK Tiran. He says, VK's books sound totally up my alley. I will be definitely checking them out. I think I told VK in the episode the idea of sort of a Sri Lankan dystopia is one I'd never thought of before. I guess it kind of semi-falls into the same category as my own Hounds of Harrigan, which we discussed in that episode. Taking a sort of love of history for that culture and expanding it into a very dystopian realm. And then on episode 87, this is the episode with David Blackmore on his harrowing tale being adrift on Lake Ontario as a child, Alex says, I haven't explored much local nonfiction, but David's story sounds excellent from his reading. Writing reminiscent of Melville's Moby Dick and the spiritual depth of Martel's Life of Pi. David and I actually met at Word on the Street, which is a massive festival every year in Toronto. And we were kind of in the same booth. They had these sort of big, massive tents set up with multiple vendors sharing booths there. And we were right next to each other, but he was kind of stuck facing a reading tent. So he didn't get the most flow-through traffic, and he kind of had to go out into the aisleway and kind of pitch his stuff there. But yeah, it was very interesting hearing his tale, his how this affected his life, and how lucky he was to have been rescued by the captain who completely knew all the various currents that was where he was going to be wind up. All right. If you, like Alex, are enjoying the show, you can feel free to leave comments on Spotify, leave them here or on any past episode, and I will get a notification of them and I will address them just like I've done here with Alex. And now, on to Andrew LiVecchi. So despite the fact that my last name is Shannon, and that 200 years ago the family name was Shanahan, I know much more about the mythology of Japan or Mongolia than I do about the Celts. But something about this feels very Celtic.
Yeah. So this book is inspired mostly by Celtic mythology, which we can talk more about what exactly that means. It's a very hotly contested category. And then a little Greek mythology, a little Norse mythology, but the main flavor I'm working with here is Celtic. And so the fun thing about the Celts, I don't know how much you want me to nerd out about the history here, but the Celts didn't write anything down until like the Middle Ages, basically, until after they had already lost a lot of their kind of traditional, forms of belief, their belief in the gods, the mythologies. And so everything we know about Celtic mythology, aside from archaeology, is from the people who who were trying to conquer them, right? Like the Romans. And the Romans were fascinated by them, but there's obviously a heavy bias there because they're like, these guys are the barbarians and they're so different from us, and we're subjugating them. And so they write things, and historians debate about the veracity of that. And then the other source is like Irish monks hundreds of years later, who are obviously operating from a very different worldview. They're Christian, and so they view all of these stories of the Morgan and um, these gods and goddesses like as they view them as just like complete fables, and they're pretty hesitant even to tell those stories. And so these are the only sources we have. Versus like the ancient Greeks, they're writing their stories while they're still believing in these beings. So it was really fascinating to kind of dive into that mythology. And the fun thing is, as a fantasy writer, writing fantasy versus like a peer-reviewed historical article, I can just make things up and take what I think is cool, and while still kind of trying to be respectful of that tradition.
Yeah, actually, the interesting thing is, just recently I was looking back over my copy of the Iliad, which,
Mm.
as if you're familiar with how it's written, these are people that believe that the gods directly intervene in the world, and they wrote them as though they were actual characters, and not in a you know theoretical way or a spiritual way, but as though they're actual entities that are characters within the story. And how interesting would it be to find like a Celtic source that is written from the same perspective, which, as you're saying, we just don't have.
I know that would be fascinating because there's a book that I'll probably butcher the pronunciation. It's the Tyne. There's a much longer name, but it's referred to as like the Irish Iliad in a way. But again, it comes from the Middle Ages, and so it's set way in the past with the kind of pre-Christian um, setting, and it's a big war story in kind of a mythical Irish setting. But we don't have anything from that kind of ancient Celtic period itself, which would just be so cool to have an Iliad level story.
Now, your book, the Son of the Thunder Goddess, is I mean, it's very epic in scope, and I know that it's kicking off a whole series, but it's basically
Mhm.
novella length. I got through it in just a few hours. Was there, I guess, why did you start with this smaller version of it?
Yeah, I had been coming off of a very long novel project. So I'd worked on a book for like 3 years. It was 140,000 words, and I kind of set that aside while I was figuring out what to do with it because it was like this is the first book I finished. I need some kind of context, some space from that. And then I really wanted to see if I could tell a story with epic stakes, but with a kind of not epic length. Um, and and so they're actually set in the same world. So that longer novel I'm currently serializing on my Substack. But then the novella, Son of the Thunder Goddess, is set like hundreds of years in the past, in kind of my analog of pre-Roman Britain. So it's bronze weapons and early iron weapons, and my goal there was to tell like a really short, accessible story that more or less is self-contained, but is also setting you up for a much bigger world. Um, and so then book two, which is already out, is like 3 times as long because my plan is kind of I'll hook you in with something that is more approachable, right? Like I've had people when I'm doing in-person signings where they're like, oh, I'm kind of in between books. Sure, I'll read this. And then, you know, they pick it up. And then kind of my plan is like they read it, it's nice and short. And then I get my hooks in them, and then they'll be in for the ride for a much longer series, which is gonna get to a longer word count overall.
Yeah, that's really interesting how you've kind of came to that. I've got a similar tactic at live events where I rope people in with like the smaller books that I've kind of just discovered by accident, where I've wanted to write shorter stuff, less involved, not have to wait like 2 or 3 years from inception to publication, and just challenge myself to write something shorter. And then I managed to get these people that are not maybe super into reading, like, oh, I used to read back before I had kids, but now it's so hard to find the time. And oh, here, I've got this nice short one. You can read this real quick. And I actually get a lot of sales that way, which is really interesting.
And
Um, at the same time, I also like meet other authors, and they've got these giant fantasy series that are really intriguing and interesting ideas. But it's like, my TBR is so long right now as it is. Do I want to add like a 7 book series onto that? So it sounds like you've
yes.
stumbled into the same little conundrum that I'm in there.
Mm. Yeah, I think there are pros and cons. I don't know if you found this as well, but because fantasy, especially epic fantasy, the expectation is that your book is taking up a nice big portion of the bookshelf. Um, and so I have found like the con side of it would be that sometimes I have run into readers who are like, well, I really only read big books. Like I only read minimum 500-page books. And so that can be a bit of a drawback. Having the second book out has helped a lot with that because then they can see it isn't just that one, 120-page book. Like there is more to it already. But then that pro of like it's such a low commitment that like, even if they really don't like it, like they're not wasting, you know, 3 months of their life reading through my book. It's been helpful when I've reached out to reviewers too, because like all these like online bloggers and booktubers and so on, like they they have like a huge wait list of people sending them their books, and I found I was able to jump the queue a little bit with a, a few of them because they look at it and they're like, oh, like that's just like a palate cleanser, right? Because they're reading like epic tome after epic tome, and so there are definitely it um, advantages to having a short, accessible work.
Yeah, I've said this before on the podcast, but I've discovered kind of the same thing where I have this epic post-apocalyptic that veers into fantasy. But it's, 1,300 pages in 2 volumes, and it's big block on my table when I do a live event. And there's a certain contingent of people that just see that and they beeline it for me. Like, I have to have that right now. I don't know what it's about, because they are the type that just wants those big books. And then there's almost no crossover. They tend to not go to my shorter stuff afterwards, and vice versa. There's people who want, my shorter stuff, and they, get intimidated by that, or maybe that's not their thing. So I'm finding there's not a lot of crossover, which I'm okay with. I'm still fine with writing to different audiences. But that was also discovered kind of by accident.
Yeah, it's funny to think that. I mean, like I personally like to read books of all sizes, so I always find it interesting kind of seeing how readers have very strong preferences sometimes, right? And they're like, I just want the big epic books. Like I don't want to be immersed and then immediately kind of I'm done with it. They're like, if I'm committing, I'm committing for the long haul. And then you have the parents with like their kids hanging off of them at the con, and they're like, please give me a short book. I don't have time for reading anymore. So ideally, like what you're doing, having multiple kinds of books, that's probably the best because then you can catch every type of reader out there.
Yeah, that's kind of inadvertently the plan, which is so
Hmm.
far working for me.
Hmm.
Um, okay, so let's dive into some of the details here. So this is basically, you said, kind of pre-Roman, like Ireland, England area. Actually, I don't know if you're gonna like this comparison or not, but I've just recently been watching the new HBO Night of the Seven Kingdoms, and it really much kind of gave me that vibe a little bit. I know that how that ultimately turns out and how your turns out is very different, but just groundedness of it in that sort of medieval style setting, it really gave me the same vibes for the opening of it.
Mm. Yeah,
Um,
I think oh, sorry.
no,
Go
sorry, you can
ahead.
go ahead.
No, I was to say, yeah, I love Martin's world building and how it's like it's almost like low fantasy, at least at first. Like he kind of ropes you in with it, like this could be historical fiction almost. It's very human centered. And then once you're hooked, then you're like, okay, now you're getting more of that sorcery and magic and the gods. And so that was something I was kind of um, intentionally with this book, keeping the gods at arm's length throughout most of the book so that you're really seeing things from that like human and not just human, but like low status human with the main characters like from the beginning and then getting kind of more epic in scope as we go on.
Yeah, so we're set in this sort of this fictional kingdom with your main character is like a farmer or shepherd. So
A shepherd, yeah.
he's not nobility or royalty or really connected to any royals in that way. He's just the on the ground, you know, low person there. But the kingdom's being invaded by, I'm gonna get the name wrong because I am not true to my heritage here, but it's like it's Sorlock or Sourlock or
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Sourlock.
yeah,
Yeah.
who's this basically marauding warlord who might be connected with these higher powers, or at least in the beginning. That's kind of what we're led to believe there. Um, I guess the topic of like magic and bringing the gods into it. You started basically in this sort of low magic setting, and it kind of escalates from there. Was there a tactic of like how when you're going to introduce the magic and how you're going to make it more real? Did you have to do kind of plot that out as you were going?
So I always have had a very strong preference for I guess what is usually called like soft magic systems, um, where as a reader you don't fully understand like how the wizard can cast spells or how a certain magic wielding character like how many points it takes to cast their fireball. Like I always prefer the more kind of I guess kind of literary mythical approach where it's kind of it's just enchanted and you don't fully understand things, which I think only works well if the point of view characters are external to that. And so like I've been really trying to make the magic, the kind of the powers of the gods like almost indistinguishable in some ways um, from sort of the natural phenomena. So when you see the thunder goddess, you're like there is thunder and lightning, and it's sort of like a a thunderstorm, but also there's a god present, and it's a kind of a deliberate blurring, in a way that, like when I read mythology, like the Iliad even or the Odyssey, sometimes you're like, is this when you hear like a peal of thunder and they're like, that's Zeus. You're like, is that just kind of the people who are attributing that, but like it's coming from the author? Like I think those kind of classifications that we have are much more modern, where we're like, okay, we need to like find a scientific explanation for everything, and then what we don't understand, then maybe that's like uh, a supernatural power. Like you just don't really see that kind of concern in a lot of pre-modern um, belief systems. So I wanted that to kind of come through in the book, that there are these magical beings, they have power, and part of what makes it dangerous and kind of awe-inspiring is that you don't fully know the limitations of those beings, um, and so if you're in the headspace of these shepherds, you're like at any point you could just be crushed and you don't even know where that comes from.
Yeah, that's always been my preference as well for the what you're describing as soft magic there. I don't need to know, how many life points it derives and how many times you have to repeat this mantra to get the spell to work. Like, I don't even need there to be this, rigid book of how the spells work. Just like the hint that there's some magic out there, and maybe some characters believe it, maybe some characters don't, and people don't fully understand it. That's my favorite way of reading fantasy. So I think you've done an excellent job there.
Think it's
Okay, so you mentioned book two is out now. Do you have like a set endpoint? You know how many books are going to be in the series?
I have an endpoint and the overall arc of how I'm going to get there, but I'm really bad at estimating how that like how long a book is going to be or how many books it will take me to tell the story. So I have the series mapped out, um and I know where all the characters are going to end up. Um I think my estimate would be between 6 to 8 books in total. And partly that's because things that I thought would maybe be, a prologue or part one of a book are turning out to be like, that actually needs its own full novel. Um, so I'm not making up as I go completely. I have the overall structure, but then as I explore that story, I realize that what can take me just one line to describe actually requires like a lot to make it emotionally impactful and to work. So I'd say probably around 8 books is what the endpoint will be.
You mentioned earlier that you can start with Son of the Thunder Goddess and it'll be kind of self-contained. You could just stop there if you're not interested in the rest of the series. Once you commit to book two, are you pretty much in it for the long haul, or is it how does that work?
I mean, that's my hope. I that's my hope with book one as well that people will want to. But I do try to wrap up the central conflict of each book in that book, but there's a much larger overarching story that isn't going to reach its like full climax. So, book two ends where like the conflict of that book is satisfied, but there's still this like we're kind of left at the doorstep of a much larger war that is coming. Um, and so like each book is going to be dealing with something kind of more localized, although even that stake is increasing in each book. But yeah, I would say book one, you can stop there, but it leaves a lot open, and book two is even more of that kind of like, hey, we're just starting to see the bigger picture in that book.
And are we sticking with Athawayne the entire time, or is he going to remain your main character? Does he become a side character at any point?
He remains the main character, but I am introducing more point of view characters as well. So in book two, the book is split between Athawayne's point of view, and then I introduce a new character, Elaf, who's a druid and a poet. And so his point of view is really interesting, I think, because he gets kind of a front row seat to what the gods are doing. Um, because Galag, the thunder goddess, is going to kind of recruit him because she's like, I want you to write a hymn in my honor. And so you're going to follow me around while I go and terrorize these mortals. And so he's kind of having a crisis of faith, as it were, in the book, but he's also giving us that like front row seat of like what are the gods actually doing. So in book one, we mostly hear about them, and then in book two, you're actually going to see them interacting more like as characters through the point of view of the poet.
Nice. Um, you mentioned briefly that you're not good at estimating length, and you have it all mapped out, but things sometimes don't always turn out the same way you plan them out there. Take us through your writing process. Like, how did this idea come about, and how did you, first take it from idea to this intro book to the larger series?
So book one, just as an example of how bad I am at the estimation, it was going to be a short story originally. And then as soon as I started writing it, I was like, oh no, like this needs more. Like it may not be a full novel, but it definitely needs to be a novella at least. And so the process with that first story was I wanted to tell a nice short but epic story, kind of in the vein of the old school sword and sorcery, like Conan the Barbarian and Elric of Melniboné, where they're very short stories, but they're all interlinked and there's an overarching narrative, but each installment is kind of short and compact. Um, and then I wanted a story that was kind of um, like a hero's origin. So you see someone going from being more or less obscure. He's kind of a nobody. Athelstan is just a shepherd, and he kind of chafes in that role because he's like he has ambitions of being a warrior, but everyone, including his brother, just stop. Like you're a shepherd. That's all you're ever going to be. Um, and then um, trouble comes knocking, and so I almost immediately the idea of having a split timeline came to me as well, which was interesting because it's such a short story that like having flashbacks is like not necessarily typical, but like I wanted it to begin in the middle of the action and then show us how Athelstan got there. Rather than beginning with like he's just an ordinary nobody um, and then show when things happen. I wanted to start off with like here's a war that is happening, and when we first meet Athelstan, he's already like the warrior figure. And then juxtaposing that with him when he's kind of, lost and confused and he doesn't really have any skills, then um, I figured like that has more kind of dramatic tension because you want to see, well, how did this guy I'm seeing in the past become this kind of very confident and, and competent warrior that I see in the present. And then the one idea that I also had from the beginning that kind of took on more shape and kind of a life uh, of its own was the idea that this is I wanted Athelstan to be kind of a different sort of fantasy hero. So um, he's not from the aristocracy. He's not a prince. He's not a knight. He's peasant, but he's also not like a chosen one in the typical way. So I kind of wanted to play with the chosen one trope where um a lot of times like the fantasy chosen one is kind of like this guy just inherently has all this great potential. He's like secretly a hero who should rule the world. It's just that he happens to be a villager. I wanted like someone who's actually ordinary, and the thing that makes him the chosen one is that a god picks him to be his hero, and to kind of fight his battles for him, and then just like what what would that feel like if you're just an ordinary guy and then your life gets completely flipped upside down and then you come into contact with this strange being who gives you power and is kind of using you as like a vessel for vengeance. Like how would you come to terms with that? Because it's like, are you even really the hero in that case, or are you just like the puppet? And that's something I I play with in the next book, and it is going to be one of the major themes that I'm working with in the series.
A plucky crew of mercenaries fly an airship into Tibet at the height of the Chinese Civil War to keep a doomsday weapon from the Maoists. This is the premise behind my 7th novel, Tiger Blues, which is available now. The core of this crew are 2 real-life badasses, Olive Yang, the Golden Triangle drug kingpin, chain-smoking and womanizing, who infiltrated communist China for the CIA and smuggled the commie soap laced with itching powder and pea flour mixed with laxatives, and Kawashima Yoshiko, who spied for the Japanese, commanded an army of 3,000 men, had novels written about them and movies produced, and who has just used their connections to Japan's infamous Black Dragon Society to escape an execution in Beijing. And both of them are little-known queer pioneers who cross-dressed as men and may have been genderqueer or trans. In my world, Olive has just been dumped, their girlfriend leaving them for their brother, based, believe it or not, in real history, a little bit hyped up for the page, of course. A blowout which loses Olive their brother as a crewman on this dangerous job in Tibet, when who should walk into the skeezy Kunming bar but the suavely dressed Yoshiko, a week out from a faked execution, broke and in need of a ticket out of China. Tiger Blues is gritty, dark, campy, flamboyantly queer, and available now. The ebook is only $1. The paperback is $20, with free shipping for a limited time. See my website store at www.jasonmshannon.com/store. For a preview of the book, go back to episodes 38 and 52 of this podcast. To learn of the full history of Olive and Yoshiko, check out episodes 39 and 40. To stay up to date on special offers and future books in the Yang Yoshiko series, subscribe to this podcast or join my mailing list. Yeah, I love that idea of if you are sort of chosen by the gods, like I guess free will comes into that, questions of free will and how much is actually of your choosing versus, how much credit can actually come to you. That's very interesting.
Yes.
Interesting to see. I'd love to see where that goes in the rest of your series. What you were saying there about it started as a short story and then it had to immediately become like novella length. That's almost exactly the same thing that happens with me every time. I'm always better at writing longer things, which is what I've been trying to challenge myself with in the past few years. Is to keep it short. Even now, the project I'm working on, which is supposed to be a prequel novella, is now longer than the one it's prequeling off of. So, you have a degree in English literature as well. How much of that education informed how you tackle these ideas?
Yeah, so I studied English all the way from BA, MA, and then PhD. And I'd say one of the best things about that training is it forces you to read things you wouldn't read otherwise. Um, and that's where I was always a big reader, right? When I was young, and I got really into mythology and history. But I was my interests were really quite narrow. So I read Homer, but I was didn't read much of Jane Austen and Charles Dickens. It was all about the myth, the battles, and yeah, in that English, in my training in those English degrees, I was forced to read a lot of things that were not something I would have picked up, but really helped shape my appreciation of what storytellers have done and can do with the novel and the short story, and even with poetry. That I don't really write much poetry myself, but I find my prose is really improved by reading poetry and thinking kind of like a poet. And that's been hugely helpful of trying to kind of use that economy of language that poetry kind of forces you to use, where like in poetry oftentimes doesn't have much of a story, a plot, maybe not even much characterization. It's all about language and about how you describe things. And so I think bringing that into genre fiction, like, will be right. Um, like, obviously, you need that plot, you need those characters, but I try to bring in some of that kind of literary sensibility. Um, and I don't know if all readers will care about that or if they'll notice it, but I definitely like I kind of have that inner English major critic where I'm like I need to I like to kind of imagine, what if an English class were studying one of my books, like what would they look at? And so like I need to have enough literary stuff in there to kind of satisfy that part of me. So like I like to play with kind of figures of speech and literary devices um and just kind of make the language more colorful than just like get the point across. Because like to me, that's part of the fun of writing isn't just like what happens, but like how you describe it and how you um you sort of paint a picture with words. And so that was something very valuable, was just studying kind of the greatest works in English and then drawing lessons from that. It was also like extremely intimidating. So it was why I put off writing my own fiction for a long time, because I was always like, well, it's not going to be as good as Shakespeare or as good as T.S. Eliot. And so that I think having that much knowledge of what literature can be was both intimidating at first, but then like just such a wealth of knowledge that I could draw on then, because I'm like, well, how should I describe this? I kind of have that bank of information, which is just very, very helpful.
As you were going through your education, is there a book that you were assigned to read that you initially went into thinking like, I'm not going to enjoy this. This is just part of the curriculum. I have to get through it, that actually you wound up really enjoying afterwards?
I There are a couple that come to mind. Paradise Lost is one that um and I don't know why I was hesitant, because I loved Homer already, but I think it was just I figured like this isn't a war story in the way that the Iliad is, and so like how exciting can it be? But that just blew my mind, and I had a really good professor um who taught that in first year, and he was just like he really kind of opened up the themes of that story and how you have this huge kind of divine conflict, and how in many ways Milton is making Satan kind of the seem like the hero of the book in the first couple of chapters or books of Paradise Lost. And so he's kind of like Achilles in many ways, where like you're like drawn to him. He's this magnetic figure. But then over the course of it, he's revealed to be kind of a phony, and he's really just out there to manipulate. But the way that he portrayed these like huge cosmic conflicts, I just found so fascinating. And once you get past the difficulties in the language, like his poetry is just beautiful. So that was one. And then I remember I had to read Jane Austen's Emma. And I struggled through that because I was like, no one is fighting here. No one is being beheaded. There are no armies that are
Mm.
preparing for war. And that was a book. I think I was too young to appreciate it at the time, and maybe too much of a guy, and I was just like I like a certain kind of book. But actually that was the same professor who got me into Milton. He was like, you may think that this is boring and nothing is happening, but that's because you're looking for the wrong thing. It's all about like the insight into human characters. And so even though I'm never going to write anything like that, there I really came to appreciate those like subtleties in how Austen is telling you so much about characters without actually telling you, right? Like it's all reading between the lines and the irony. And it's so valuable, even if you're writing stories about where people do get their heads cut off. That when they're when you're trying to flesh out their characters as fully human, those are really valuable insights, I think.
What is your approach to research? Like, how much research did you have to put into Son of the Thunder Goddess? I know you said it's fantasy and you can kind of pick and choose and fill in the gaps in what the history is not left behind. But how much, like, how deep did you dive into what history there is?
Pretty deep. I picked a period I already had a decent amount of familiarity with. Um, so I wasn't researching from scratch in the way that I would be if I picked a place and time that I really don't know much about. Um, and then so it was like a lot of it was just revisiting that. And I really like reading primary sources, like getting into something from the era that I'm trying to emulate, because I find that just helps me get into that mental space of thinking like an ancient person rather than like my 21st century self. And so while I was writing this, I was reading through Caesar's Gallic War, which again is written by a guy who is conquering the Celts and committing atrocities against them, but he also is like really interested in their culture, and so a lot of what we know about them comes from Caesar, and that was just like really interesting having that kind of in the background while I was writing. Um, but that was probably the biggest deep dive research I was doing. Most of it was more um, kind of searching things online as I would run into questions. So there was a point where there's a prince who dies in battle, and then I have a chapter that is taking place kind of in the setting of the funeral, right? And so that was a moment where I was like, okay, like how exactly did ancient Celtic peoples deal with their dead? Because I could make something up, but um, and it is fantasy, but I want it to be like really almost historical fantasy where it I find things feel more authentic if they are based on real history. And even if you go on to tweak it, um, it just kind of has more credibility. So um, I read up about the Druids and various religious practices, and um, this is where pure internet searches can kind of lead you wrong. The Druids are one of those things that we don't know very much about, but a lot of people are really into. Um, so you find a lot of like non-historical information on them, but um, I find a little can go a long way where like you read what we do know, and then that kind of the mysteries kind of get my imagination flowing, and then um, allow me to create something that isn't historical fiction, but it is like it. At, I at least hope it feels historical because I'm kind of getting the inspiration from that research.
I know exactly what you're describing there. I'm dealing with the same thing in the series slash extended universe I'm writing now, where I feel like I need to have a very close grasp on the actual history. I'm writing about real people in some instances. Um, and just the geography and the religion or there's a Buddhist influence, but there's also a Catholic influence because of colonialism. And there's a lot going on there. I want to make sure I get it right, but then I also just find inspiration in that and I twist it and turn it and make these characters larger than life at times. Um, it sounds like, and from what I've seen from looking into you, you have a bit of as much of a love of history as I do. Um, is the sort of Roman or like Celtic pre-Roman Europe a favorite history period of yours, or do you have a favorite? Do you kind of bounce around?
I am anything pre-modern and kind of European is like my my comfort zone. It's my favorite. Medieval Europe is probably my top, although I love anything Greek and Roman and Celtic as well. Um, yeah, I like if I sometimes I realize that I'm kind of in that not a rut because I like it, but I'm kind of in that comfort zone, and so then I'll try to read something about a culture, a history that is more unfamiliar to me. But if I'm just kind of enjoying myself, I'll just read more history about the Roman Republic and ancient Greece and Thermopylae and the Wars of the Roses. Like that's really my comfort zone is like medieval and then classical Europe. I can't get enough of that.
Well, maybe we can go back and forth and trade a few interesting, quirky little history stories. And since Europe is your sort of your center point, maybe I can introduce you to something a little bit further out, further afield, and we'll each trade back some
Yeah,
stories.
that would be cool.
You want to go first?
Sure. Okay, I am currently reading a biography of Edward the First, the English king from Braveheart. And uh, one part of his career. This is before he became a king, actually. He went on crusade, and it was kind of a disastrous crusade. He was supposed to be following the French king Louis the Ninth, who was like considered a saint. He was like kind of the most pious king. He died pretty early on, so the French were like, "Well, we're going home." They left, but the English were like, they just got there, and they wanted to try to, free the Holy Land, and so he was like severely outnumbered, but he kind of stuck with it, and he refused to, sign a truce because he was like, "I'm here to conquer, not to compromise." Anyway, he was the victim of an assassination attempt. So these uh, assassins were allowed into his tent. He thought they were there to talk about terms, and then they tried to stab him. He beat the one to death, but not before he was wounded by the poisoned blade. And then at this point, the historians are kind of they're conflicted because the romantic story is that his wife, Eleanor, was there, and then she uh, sucked the poison out of his wound, and so saved his life. And so she kind of, risked her own life for her husband, and it's like a tale of courtly love and chivalry. Other sources say like actually she wasn't there; it was just one of his friends, which is maybe less heroic seeming. But yeah, uh, that's just a story that kind of stick out to me. That's a king that goes on to be this like great conqueror. He conquers Wales and Scotland, but before that, he had this kind of, his his great crusade that didn't really go anywhere, and he almost died. But his wife saved him by drinking up the poison that was in his blood.
Really, really interesting. I haven't heard that one before. That's cool.
Mhm.
Okay, I'll tell you one myself. Let's see if I can do this without going too far afield with all these random details here. Um, I'll steer clear for listeners. I'll steer clear of the stuff I'm working with now with all of Yang and Kawashima Yoshiko because I think I've beat that horse to death a little bit and I don't want to bore them too much. I'll go back to something I was researching a while back. This is the Mongol Empire.
Good.
I'm gonna just use English easy pronunciation. So Genghis's campaign against the Khwarezmian dynasty empire, which is kind of modern Iran and a lot of the stands, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan area. And this was done as basically a revenge mission for having killed one of his interpreters. But there's a particular campaign going on in there in Nishapur, which is modern day Iran, and a the word used is basically translates to son-in-law. So one of Genghis's son-in-laws is besieging this walled city. He catches an arrow to the neck and dies. It's a smaller force, so they have to withdraw and go through the funeral rites, and it's overwintering. This is like November, so it's probably some weather related stuff going on there as well. In the spring, Genghis sends his youngest son, note here, princely son, because there's all kinds of hierarchies of concubinal sons and everything going on there as well. And the widow of the man who died, which we can read into is his daughter, to then deal with this city and exact revenge. And the exact revenge was like leave nothing standing, like kill even the cats and dogs and so on. And so this daughter, whose name we're not given, and even the son-in-law's name we're not given, um, shows up. She's sitting on a like golden throne on like a palanquin type thing. Uh, all the boulders and all the countryside around there were gathered up to be used as, trebuchet type things. And the source is a little unclear in reading, like the original source written way back in the day, but something like 6 or 7 days later is when the walls are breached, and the Mongols march inside. 400 craftsmen are saved to be used for siege engine building and what have you. So essentially forced into slavery, and everyone else is put to death. And the daughter herself gets to march inside with her own sort of royal guard to find any survivors in Saddam Hussein holes. And that's, again, the timeline is not clear here. It seems like it takes place in about a week or two, but it could have been over the course of 6 months. But given the length of the whole campaign with the Empire is probably not that long. And a much later source then tells us the number of dead is 1.747 million at this city, which is almost certainly inflated. But even if it's inflated tenfold, how is not the worst woman to have ever lived? And we don't know her name. There have been people who have speculated on the name, and the name that commonly comes up is Tumalun, his fourth daughter. There's reasons to suspect that is just an easy answer people rab for. Not saying it's incorrect. It's just we don't have enough information to actually go for. And as to how much she actually contributed to the campaign is probably debatable as well. It's probably Genghis's son that did most of it. So that's me caveating everything at the end there. But still, I find that just fascinating that this is, horrific event happened and we know next to nothing about who was involved.
Yeah, that was wild. I love Mongol history too. Like that's one of the few things that I've branched out into, and it's fascinating. But the scale is just crazy. Like the casualties are always so astronomically high. like that figure was it 1.4 million? Like that's just was so high. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's people have again, speculated on how that's impossible to have achieved that. These are people using swords and bow and arrows. They don't have a nuke with them. There's no Zyklon B. Like, how are they accomplishing this and still moving on? But then there's other authors out there who have been like, well, if they did this and each Mongol, branched them off and took this many people at a time out into the field, and it could be done. And there's other cities that are just been wiped off the face of the earth who are now just, like these ruins that no one lives there that the Mongols destroyed. So it's like, yeah, there's a bit of column A, bit of column B going on there. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to ask you where people can find you, but also I want to touch on your Substack because you are very active on your Substack, including telling some interesting historical stuff going on there as well. I've never used Substack before, so how are you finding that as an author in reaching out to potential readers?
I really like it. I mostly got into it because I kept hearing about how you need to have a newsletter as an author. And I found a lot of it very complicated. And Substack just works really well for me because it is a newsletter, but they got rid of most of the complicated features, which can be a con if you want to use those. But I was like, I just want to be able to write things and have them go directly to someone's email. And it does that really well. It's kind of, that hybrid of a blog and a newsletter. And that fits what I'm trying to do with it because I like to write author updates, which are more like a newsletter, but then write kind of longer form articles about history and mythology, fantasy, and then kind of find an audience that likes reading longer work, which Substack seems to be one of the few places on the internet where you can find those people, right? That where you can write an article of like 4,000 words. Even I think my longest is maybe 6,000 words. So it's a hefty, long article, but like uh, I've had people read through the whole thing and then comment on it, right? So there, that seems to be the place like for people who like reading, which is great as a writer. I've mostly done nonfiction on there, that kind of relates to what I'm working on. So I have a series on monsters from medieval folklore, and that intersects with what I like to write about, but it's nonfiction. I very recently started experimenting with fiction as well there. So I am currently serializing a novel, War of Princes, which is a medieval fantasy. Is similar to my Athawayne books in that it's very historically grounded. There is magic, there are powers, but they're not center stage, at least at the beginning. And so I've been running that for 5 weeks now. I release a new chapter every Friday, kind of in chunks. I think of them in terms of like a season of like a streaming TV show, like a night of the Seven Kingdoms or Breaking Bad back in the day, where like you get a chunk of like 10 to 12 chapters, and then there'd be a little break and then another chunk. And yeah, so far that's going well. Um, Another thing I like about using Substack is that unlike a regular newsletter, which is usually kind of um, not um, not public facing, on Substack people can actually find your stuff if they're looking for the right keywords. And so I've had growth that way, and then also just by talking about it and kind of bringing readers directly to my Substack.
All right, and where can people find you?
Yeah, so you can go to my website, andrewlivecchi.com, and that has links to my books and to my newsletter. I have a contact form there as well. My my Substack is called the Mead Hall, which just by that name you can guess the kind of topics I'm looking at. And my books are available in ebook and paperback. The ebook anywhere you can buy ebooks: Amazon, Kobo, Barnes and Noble, Apple. The paperback is available through Amazon and Ingram Spark, so you can order it through your library or bookstore. I'm also very active right now in the Indigo scene. So for people who live in Ontario, I've been doing a lot of signing events there. So you can find my books in Cambridge and Kitchener, Waterloo, London, Burlington. My next event is in May, on the 31st, and I'm going to be at the Indigo in Square One. That'll be my first time there. So I'm looking forward to it. If you are in the area and you are free, come by and we can chat about history, and fantasy and all that stuff.
All right, Andrew LiVecchi, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you. It's been a great chat.
OMG girlfriend, are you curious about buying one of my books, but you're not sure if you're ready for dark musings on nihilism versus fatalism? Obviously here I'm talking about the Hounds of Horrigen. Or femme fatales killing corrupt government officials is not your thing because it's so last season. Come on, girl, I'm talking about the Moon Panther here. Or maybe the nuclear sword of Damocles in Rain's agenda hits a little too close to home. Well, good news. Attila the Valley Girl is my shortest and simplest book. There's no deeper theme that hijacks the story. No social commentary, no unnecessary subplots. It's just the platinum blonde scourge of God, threatening Rome while dressed in hot pink. What's not to love? You can pick up Attila the Valley Girl for only the cost of a venti double mocha caramel espressiato. Or join my mailing list for an exclusive link to the free ebook audiobook combo. All right, Eastern Europe's not going to conquer itself, so bye, and you can go back to the show. Thanks so much to Andrew for coming on the podcast. You can check out all of his links in the description. And again, if you are on Substack, you can follow him there and collect his serialized releases of chapters for Book 3. Coming up on the podcast, I'm going to have Christian Jerry Marchione back on. He has a new book out called Who Killed Arnold Muller, which is very different in tone and style from his first book. This one is a murder mystery set in small-town Ontario, and it was a riveting read all the way through. I blew through that in no time, and I'm very, very interested in talking to him about that. I'm also going to be talking to Christy Lee about her book, Mr. Brightside. Christy also hosts a Twitch stream, and so by the time this goes out, you may have already seen me on there. We're going to do a sort of cross-publishing sort of thing going on there. But next week, I am talking to Joe Mahoney about his book, A Time and a Place, which is a sort of portal fantasy, time travel. We talk about where exactly this fits in. And we talk about the audiobook making process, because it was Joe who first kind of inadvertently inspired me to do my own audiobooks. That is going to be next week. I will be at the Blueberry Blast Festival in Nipigon, Ontario on August 14th weekend, Cogs and Clockwork Steampunk Festival in Fergus, Ontario on September 12th, and CanCon in Ottawa on the October 16th weekend. Stay up to date on all of that stuff. You can go to www.jasonshannon.com/events. You can follow my social media, or you can join my subscriber list. Taming the Laser Leopard, my new novella, will be coming out later this year. Details to be coming soon. All right, cheers, everyone.